Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. Hi, I'm Scott Sorrell. I'll be your host here for the Real Science Exchange, and together we're going to gather for a fan favorite, and that's the Journal Club with Dr. Bill Weiss. I'd like to also welcome my co-host, Dr. Clay Zimmerman. Welcome back.
Thanks, Scott. Good to be here. I've got a hard cider here in my cup this evening. Scott, what are you drinking?
Well, I need to find out from Bill first.
I am drinking a Smithwick's red ale.
A red ale.
Very malty beer. Tastes very good. So,
all right.
So imported directly from Ireland. So
yeah. So Clay, to answer your question, I was on vacation last week down in Virginia Beach. I got two sons that are working down there, and I went to the Cavalier Hotel. This hotel was built in 1927. At the time, it was really the only hotel there on the beach, and it's really kind of opulent. It's gorgeous, and kind of gives you a feel for being back in the 1920s, right? The Roaring 20s, during Prohibition and all of that. And as part of their story, they've got a distillery in their basement. Because of Prohibition, and they claim that there was a lot of illicit drinking going on there during those times. But the distillery is called the Tarnished Truth, and so I went on a distillery tour and did some bourbon tasting and some moonshine tasting, which wasn't bad, by the way. But I picked up something called Discretion, which is one of theirs. It's kind of a high wheat bill bourbon and quite nice. And so I'm having that tonight in honor of my my vacation. So with that, gentlemen, looking forward to this Journal Club. Cheers.
Tonight's pubcast stories are brought to you by ReaShure Precision Release Choline. ReaShure is the most researched encapsulated choline on the market today, consistently delivering results to your transition cows of higher peak milk, reduced metabolic disorders, and even in utero benefits to her calf, leading to growth and health improvements. Visit balchem.com to learn more.
We'll be doing something a little bit different tonight. It's just going to be a three of us, and the paper is one that we'll certainly have plenty of conversation around. So let's dive into the research titled Associations Between Days in the Close-Up Group and Milk Production, Transition Cow Diseases, Reproductive Performance, Culling and Behavior, and Calving of Holstein dairy cows, and that was authored by Van Jacob et al. So, Dr. Weiss, how in the world did you come about selecting this one?
Well, it's actually, there's another paper there it's in press right now, so it'll be coming out from the same group.
Okay.
And it addresses this, again, a question when I worked at the university in extension, I got very often, and that is, I have a pre-fresh. How long do cows have to stay in the pre-fresh group? And this study, which is quite large, it's a field study, but it's quite large, attempts to answer that, and as to what's the optimal. Basically, it's a range of days in pre-fresh. It's usually a much more expensive diet than the far offs. You have cow numbers you have to work around and so on. So it is an important practical question. Some farms, because of, again, just calving times, they're going to have to shorten up the period. What's that going to cost if they go too short? Other times they miss a breeding cycle or something. These cows are stuck in there much longer. And is that detrimental? So I think it's a very important practical question that these papers addressed.
I guess I'm a bit surprised. Ever since I've been in the industry, it's been 21 days. And so I'd assumed there's been lots of research to establish that. And so how was the first 21 days established?
If you look there's been a little bit, but not to the extent where it usually was short and long, maybe a week versus 3 weeks or so. Some of it, I think, has just to do with management. And you start looking at pen sizes and all, and on a typical farm, with 21 days, it gave about the right size pen. So I think it ended up being pretty close to the right number based on this study, but I think it was kind of an arbitrary, not quite arbitrary, but a little bit arbitrary of a guess.
Oh, interesting.
And I guess too, originally, if you look at pre-fresh, it wasn't to feed anionic salts. That came later. It was just what we call steam up the cows,
Yeah.
adapt the rumen. And a lot of people thought to adapt this rumen, 3 weeks was about the right amount of time. And what we know now is that's actually a very minor benefit of pre-fresh, is to adapt the rumen. Is the anionic salts and other additives are the reason to have a pre-fresh.
Makes sense. So, Bill, why don't you tell us about the hypothesis for this paper?
Okay. It's actually very straightforward, and it's just they hypothesized that if the pre-fresh period cows were in there too short, it was detrimental to health and future productions, and if they were in there too long, it was detrimental to health and production. And they didn't define that because that was kind of defined from the data they had. And they went to 18 farms, large farms in Germany. They averaged about 1,100 cows. So it's a huge study. 18 farms is a really, really big study. All Holsteins. Average 305-day production was around 22,000 pounds. So a little bit less than U.S. standards, but still good production. And they had to have the requirements to be in this study is they had to have a pre-fresh. They did not set a time. They could have, they didn't say you have to shoot for 21 days or whatever. They just said you have to have a pre-fresh. They wanted to limit it to just farms that had anionic diets. So all the pre-fresh diets have varying degrees of anionic diets. And they had to have certain record keeping systems so that they could get all this data they needed. Had to be on DHI, had to do something like Dairy Comp, just to get the data.
All right, good. So I wanted to circle back real quick, Bill, on kind of the protocol. I was curious if they intentionally also looked at getting herds that had different lengths of pre-fresh groups.
They didn't explicitly say that, but they do have a nice figure in there with a histogram of all the lengths of pre-freshes that were in this study. And it's a wide range. It goes from 1 day in the pre-fresh, which obviously was a mistake. They missed that cow, up to 42 days. And they actually, there's cows that had more than 42 days, but they said that's an extreme. They stopped at 42 days. And they also said anything less than less than 2 days in there, those cows got thrown out. But it's a huge, most of them would be between 1 week and 4 weeks. So a very good distribution of data here.
Okay.
And like most farms, cows only moved once a week. So you're always going to have, they might have shot for 21 days, but just because of once a day, they're going to be plus or minus 3 or 4 days. And the means were, again, about what for cows. And I should mention, I forgot that heifers were included in this. So heifers went through the pre-fresh as well, and then they followed those guys. And the mean days in the pre-fresh for cows was 18 days, so very close to the 3 weeks that are recommended. Heifers were only in there on an average of about 2 weeks. And they didn't explain why that was. Again, it would be a farmer decision. It wasn't the investigators. And it might be the farmers only wanted heifers in there a shorter period of time. But they don't address that. And long ago there was a study out of Michigan State. I can't recall the authors, but they looked at heifers and with anionic salts, and it was detrimental for those guys. It was actually, they increased ketosis and other things. Data since then has not been as negative. In other words, heifers don't seem to be as adversely affected by DCAD as that first study. So it might be the producers said, heifers don't have hypocalcemia issues, so maybe let's put them in shorter. But it is shorter for the heifers.
And were these all German dairies?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
And if you look at the diets, the pre-fresh diets, they don't give a lot of detail, but very, very typical to U.S. diets. They had crude proteins were, most of them were between about 12 and 14, 15%. So pretty typical. Starches right around 20%, again, very typical. Fibers, the low looks like it's about a 33%. The high is 47. So again, and a lot of range here, which is good for these types of study. But again, on average, very typical to U.S. Diets. DCADs, these were not extremely aggressive in DCAD. One was, and these are per kilo. One was -4. The highest was -200. But most of them, probably of these 18 herds, probably 15 of them are less than about 60, -60. So, what we would consider moderate DCAD, not extreme DCAD. Again, they looked at future production after they calved, and then which is the bulk of this paper, and then they also looked at health effects. And with pre-fresh, at least in my opinion, the main goal of a pre-fresh is to prevent health problems. To prevent health problems, you get the milk, and so it's important. A good thing about these papers is they do spend quite a bit of time on at least clinical disease. They did not do a lot of subclinical diagnoses.
In what period of time did they look at milk, Bill? Was that full lactation?
No, it would have been, they usually on what they call first test milk. So let's say first 2 to 3 weeks, something like that. I think they might have done more on some herds, but I think most of it was, let's say the fresh period, first 3-4 weeks, something like that.
Okay. What
they found, basically in a nutshell, is too short is bad and too long is bad. And it was, and I should also say it differed between heifers and cows. The effect of duration differed between heifers and cows. In heifers, the longer they were in there, in the pre-fresh, the more milk they got, first test. And again, you think it's not calcium metabolism, because heifers don't have that big of a problem with calcium. So they hypothesized is maybe the pre-fresh diets probably were a little higher in crude protein than far offs, so maybe that extra nutrients for a longer period of time helped the heifers. A limitation of this paper is they don't show me the far off diets. So they just said they met NASEM or NRC requirements. So let's say they were 12%, but I don't know. But heifers, more than the 14 days was beneficial. For cows, it was quadratic. And with heifers, it was linear. The longer they were in there, the better. There was with cows, it was quadratic. Short was bad, long was bad. This could be health related, calcium. It could be, again, you wouldn't think so much on nutrient supply, but it could be. In the short ones, it could be a nutrient supply. And the long ones, if these pre-fresh diets had more energy, they might be getting fat, and or increasing body condition, and that we know is detrimental. So I can't give you the actual mode of action, but again, based on production, less than a week were bad, more than about 4 weeks was bad. There is a range in there. There isn't a day that works, but less than a week, and they may even said less than 10 days, and there was bad. More than about 4 weeks were bad. Then some other things they found, which some, as I would expect, some was a bit of a surprise. On health, in both heifers and cows, that they were in there less than a week, it was a risk factor for retained placenta. And that, to me, makes sense. It's going to be, for cows, 7 days probably isn't enough to moderate calcium metabolism. We know hypocalcemia is a risk factor for retained placenta. I assume they don't provide the details on this, but generally pre-fresh diets are a little stoked up in vitamins and minerals, selenium, vitamin E especially. Those reduce retained placenta, so it might be related to immune function. It might be related to calcium, but short pre-fresh periods increased RPs, retained placentas. And again, that's cows and heifers. And it was quite substantial. It wasn't just a small effect. It was basically, if they were in there 7 days or less, they had an average RP rate of 9%. At 14 days, this is for heifers. At 14, 21, 28 days, it was about 3.5%. So, threefold increase for heifers. For cows, 15% if they were in there 7 days or less. And then it bounced around 7 to 8% if they were in there longer. So, that's not a small amount, very big. And again, it may be calcium, it may be vitamins and minerals, or it may be both. So short was, they identified for cows, short was clearly worse than long. So if you got to make a mistake, leave them in there, move them a little bit early rather than waiting a bit. And what was a bit surprising to me, even though what I just said, was on clinical hypocalcemia, not subclinical. And clinical was defined, they treated cows with calcium and they got better. That's their definition. That prevalence was lowest at 2 weeks. In other words, it wasn't, 7 days wasn't the worst, even though that was the worst for retained placenta and metritis as well. But 14 days, less than 14, the least amount of clinical milk fever happened if cows were in there 2 weeks. Whereas again, you'd think with the other diseases, the worst would be different. And then it increased with more days in there. Clinical hypocalcemia, the risk increased, which again, I would think it would be kind of flat. I can see it not getting better, but I would have thought it would be kind of flat. Because when you look at calcium metabolism, 2 weeks is probably enough for these cows to physiologically react to DCAD. And so I sit there, and when I read these things, and when I say, well, this isn't what I expect, and I try to figure out why. And, DCAD by definition basically puts these cows in negative calcium balance. That's how they work. And so maybe if they're in there 4 or 5 weeks, they're becoming depleted in calcium, and that would be an increase their chances of a calcium deficiency. That's just supposition. But so again, for milk fever, which is a lot of people put it in, long is worse than short. For retained placenta, just the opposite. So 14 and 21 days, there wasn't. I'll give you the results here if I can find them. On clinic, and again, I keep saying clinical. This is not subclinical. At short 7 days, it was about 3%. Then it decreased to about 2.5%, and then so there wasn't much difference between 7 and 14 days in a pre-fresh. But by 35 days, it was up to 6%, so it doubled. Yeah, long is bad. 28 days or 21 days, which is kind of, again, the standard, it was higher, but only 3.5%. So it wasn't going to 3 weeks, wasn't terrible, but shorter was better for hypocalcemia, clinical. If you look at other diseases, metritis, high with short periods, which again fits the calcium, high subclinical calcium. It also could fit vitamin E and selenium, maybe some other vitamins. 21 days gave you the least amount of metritis. Ketosis, and this was subclinical ketosis, standard, I think it was 1200, higher than 1200. It was best at 3 weeks. So again, this 3-week thing keeps coming up in most situations. And milk production, as I mentioned, it was best for about the 3 weeks gave the best milk production. Cows, if on cow effects, the maximum production was 21 days. So it's pretty flat between 15, 16 days and 25 days. So again, if you move once a week, shoot for 3 weeks, you're gonna do fine. But I look at this data and say, if calcium metabolism is an issue on a farm, you might lean toward shorter, go more toward the 2 week than 3 weeks, because you're going to miss some cows. If these other issues like mastitis, metritis, RPs, then shoot for the 3 weeks, and so that's how I would make that decision as to where to go. Definitely don't be less than a week, or try to avoid being less than a week. Try to avoid being more than 35 days. That's when things really crash.
Do you have any idea what the dietary mineral levels were in these diets?
No, they don't. They give me the ash, which doesn't tell me much. But no, they give very little other than the protein, fiber, and starch and DCAD. Very little details on this, other than they do say formulated to meet NASEM requirements. But again, I don't know. And for DCADs, especially at these pretty modest DCADs, dietary calcium doesn't seem to be a big factor in much. But maybe for 35 days or 40 days, it becomes a bigger factor. The studies that are done looking at calcium and DCAD is 3 weeks. Since they've put them in there for 3 weeks.
So Bill, what are your thoughts, related to the higher somatic cell score and the cows that were in the close-up pen longer? What do you think's going on there?
That kind of messes up my vitamin E selenium theory. First, it wasn't a huge effect. That was not a huge effect. But it can be if these diets were higher in energy than the far offs, they are gaining condition that can suppress immune function. High BHBAs are related to reduced immune cell function. That could be it. It could be a hypocalcemia. Subclinical hypocalcemia has been shown to reduce the function of some of these immune cells, neutrophils, and so on. So it could be something along those lines, but I really don't know. But it was positive, or it was a negative effect, but it was not a huge increase in mastitis or cell store. I did forget to mention on the DCAD, I had this wrote down as my first thing here, was the urine pHs were around 6.6. So again, they're acidified, not terrible. I think it's a moderate DCAD. So if they were stronger in DCAD, this effective time might be worse. That's again my hypothesis. But then on the other hand, it might be on the shorter ones might be less negative, have less negative effects if it was a stronger DCAD. I don't know. Yeah. So I wouldn't extrapolate this too much if you're got very, very low urine pHs.
Yeah. Some of these were barely negative, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they didn't show a histogram of the urine pHs. They're just the mean. So again, some of these, a DCAD of 0 is still going to depress urine pH. You won't get anywhere near the 6, but it is going to depress it. But I don't know how much.
If you look at the starch composition of these diets, there is quite a range in starches here.
The low I can see here is about 12%. The high is about 27%. Something so huge range.
Yeah.
And I'd wonder, the old theory of using pre-fresh to steam up cows would be the the 25% starch pre-freshes.
Right.
All the new data says, you actually higher starch is detrimental, or most of the data say higher starch. And so some of these might be following that approach where starches are in the high teens, and then the steam up approach, that would be the 26. That's my guess would be. It's the opinion of the nutritionist as to which is a bigger benefit. And again, the other thing, we don't know the details on the farm. It might be this is what they had. They might have to feed a ton of corn silage, so it's going to be higher in starch. So you don't know, but it is a huge range. I'd be surprised in the U.S. if we went out and surveyed 18 farms, you'd find this big of a range. I'd be surprised, but you might.
Yeah, Bill, I was going to kind of change directions a little bit. I was intrigued by your comments or the findings that heifers tended to perform better with a little bit longer pre-fresh period. And I'm wondering if those findings were great enough that we ought to consider doing anything different with heifers pre-fresh.
They were, to me, enough to, because again, the cost isn't that great. I mean, the pre-fresh diet, because of DCAD, is going to cost more than a far-off thing. But the heifers don't eat that much, and we're talking probably 7 days longer. And I think it would be worthwhile. Or again, what I'm a little bit hedging here because I don't know the far-offs. It might be they were just not fed enough in the far-offs. But to me, this data was compelling enough, at least, to say put heifers in for the same period as a cow, 3 weeks, rather than what these producers chose to do is, again, about a 2-week period. So if in the U.S. and or elsewhere, if you move them all the same 3 weeks, I think that would be the advice I'd give, rather than having short ones for the heifers and 3 weeks for the cows. And I say, the other thing I used to get questions again is do heifers need pre-fresh? Do heifers need anionic salts? The answer is probably not. But on simplicity, again, it's just sometimes you just do things so it's probably not going to be negative. It's not going to hurt, and it might just make things easier. It gets these heifers. A lot of farms aren't big enough. They're going to have to co-mingle heifers and dry cows. They're less aggressive. Usually these pens are not crowded, and it might just be beneficial, there may be some benefits for this. And I guess, as I just said, that might be one of the reasons heifers did better. If they were in there longer, they just socially adapted, which they made no measurements about that, but it might be nothing to do with nutrition. It might just have been better environments in general for those heifers from where they were coming from.
True. Yeah. Yeah.
So, Bill, one question you have for a lot of your authors is, what's the next step? And so our authors are not here today. So if you were the researchers, what do you think the next steps would be?
Well, I think this is the time is fits what's done and fits the management of a lot of herds. So I think that's the 3 weeks is a good thing. There are herds in the U.S. and elsewhere that they do not have facilities where they can have 2 groups. They don't. So they have a 1 group dry cow. A lot of these farms still have calcium issues. So could study, and there's been at least one I'm familiar of, but what about let's go the whole full Monty here and go a full dry period with DCAD, heifers included. And the studies I've seen have been using the cows, and they weren't detrimental to cows. But would it, just because they can't manage or have the facilities for 2 groups, can I feed DCAD to heifers for the whole 50 days or so? That I'd look at, and it intrigues me on mode of action. That won't help producers much, but it does help science and figure things out, is why some of this, just the short period on RPs, again, makes sense, but then the mastitis one, doesn't make sense. One of those don't mesh. So is there going on? What's going on there? And then this, I wish I would measure subclinical hypocalcemia. They didn't take blood samples, but that would be to look at this with what we know now about the value of blood samples and how to the protocols to take, the number of days to measure, and all this stuff. So look at that. Do these long pre-fresh periods increase prevalence of subclinical and the transient, and there's different words for these things, but which are the risk factors for all these other diseases. So I'd like to add something like that to this study, but I don't think we need a lot of more work on the right amount of days in there. I think this answered it pretty well, that we happen to pick the right day, and that's about 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. But I guess, again, it's risk. We don't know when cows are going to calve. Even if we have perfect breeding data, we still don't know. And this allows you to pick your error. Do I want to be a little short? In other words, maybe move a cow in a week later than I normally would, or a little bit early, depending on problems you are experiencing on your farm.
So Bill, in this study, were the cows that were either in there for a short period of time or a longer period of time, was that done by design, or was it all retrospective?
No, it was all retrospective. So the farm, they could have missed. The cows can just calve late. Gestation lengths are plus or minus. They could have missed a breeding cycle. Had the wrong breeding date in there. They could have just said this cow needs condition or something and move it on, but that was not. It was retrospective. The producer made the decision to move cows.
Do you know, was it in the data set as far as twinning and so forth, especially for some of these short days in the close-up pen?
I think, and I'm pretty sure they excluded twins.
Okay.
So if a cow, I'm almost positive that was in there. And then they excluded ones that were obviously way long, that just didn't fit. And
right.
Again, if they were only in there a day or two, those got excluded. I didn't give you the number of cows. There's 13,000 cows in this data set. About a third of those are heifers. So this is not, and again, 18 farms. So this is a huge data set. So I think we can take the conclusions pretty much to heart.
The cows that were in this had gestation length. Yeah, they were between 262 and 292 days.
And I forgot to mention, they did a lot of fancy statistics, which we won't get into. But gestation length was a covariate. Because sometimes if they calve, if the calving is delayed for whatever reason, you get a big calf and you have increased health problems. So they corrected for that independent of days in the pre-fresh. So they did try to correct for just the natural, for these either premature births or just long gestation periods for whatever reason, which I think helped reach these in conclusions. I think that was an important thing to do.
All right, as we get close to wrapping this up, any other big things we need to share?
Pre-fresh for health. I guess that's still the big thing, and production will follow. So again, depending on if you have just no specific health problems, this data would say shoot for 3 weeks, plus or minus a little bit, but shoot for 3 weeks. But again, if hypocalcemia is an issue, you would want to move. If you're moving in once a week, you'd probably want to delay a little bit so the average time in pen is less, if that's the major health issue. So one size doesn't fit all, depending on what the herd's specific problem is.
Clay, that was a great summary. You have anything to add to that?
Tonight's last call question is brought to you by NitroSure Precision Release Nitrogen. NitroSure delivers a complete TMR for the rumen microbiome, helping you feed the microbes that feed your cows. To learn more about maximizing microbial protein output while reducing your carbon footprint, visit balchem.com/nitrosure.
I want to congratulate Bill on picking another great paper here. Certainly, really great topic. There's a lot of interest around this. Maybe the other thing, just to summarize again, and Bill had hit on this earlier. These nulliparous animals that are coming in here, we want to make sure we certainly don't want to short them.
The more we learn about heifers, or first lactation, they're not just little cows.
Right.
They are different. And a lot of the studies in the past, I did the same thing. We just would block by parity and forget about the effect, remove it statistically and forget about it. But more and more papers have enough first lactation animals, and now they can start looking at dietary responses or management responses. And a lot of things are very different between those two types of animals.
Have any other thoughts to share?
They did look at culling, early lactation culling. They said 60-day culling in the first 60 days. Again, these cows that had short time in the period, less than 7 days, had a greatly increased risk to get culled the first 2 months. So again, that's telling you, pay attention to breeding dates and try and get these cows in there at least 2 weeks. And the other thing one other thing on reproduction, days in the pre-fresh had no effects on stillbirths, or they didn't have calf weights, but no effect on stillbirths. So in general, most of the effects of the days in pre-fresh were health related, and you don't know if the production responses could have been because of better health, but they did often get better production if they were around that 3-week pre-fresh period.
So they reported involuntary culling. Did they happen to report death loss?
I did not see that.
So the other thing they reported in the Paris cows was the longer they were in the close-up pen, the fat to protein ratio in the milk varied. It increased, right, with longer days in the close-up pen. You have any speculation on that, Bill?
It seems like that means these cows are gaining condition, getting fat, then they calve, they don't eat. We know that if higher condition mean lower intakes, mobilization gets dumped into the milk. So that would be they may have had, if these diets were too high in energy, for a couple weeks, it doesn't matter, but as it longer and longer, then condition goes up, and then that drop in intake that happens around calving tends to be worse, which again causes mobilization that increases the fat. It's coming from mobilized body conditions why you get these very high fat to protein ratios, which you like, but in fresh cows it usually means there's some issues.
Yeah, maybe especially on the 26% starch pre-fresh diet.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and they did not break these down and look, and they probably didn't have enough data, but they didn't try to correlate dietary factors to any of these responses. But that would be a neat thing to do.
Clay, why don't you put a bow on it from your perspective for us?
Well, I think we've had it right all along, and just further confirmation that this 21-day close-up period it is the optimal here, and we want to avoid the extremes here, right? We don't want the really short days. Certainly 7 days or less was detrimental. From a practical standpoint, if we know a cow's carrying twins, we need to take that into account when we're putting them into the close-up pen, and certainly in the mature cows, we want to avoid really excessively long days in close-up.
I should mention also, just because of the data, the heifers may suffer from really long days too, but they just didn't have as many. They didn't go as long as the cows. So, I won't say the data says very long wasn't bad for heifers, but they didn't have a lot of very long periods in the heifers. So they might be bad for them as well. But again, it fits that the 3-week thing fits very, very good for both types of animal.
All right. Clay, thank you for joining us here again for another very good journal club. They're always good, but this one is at the top of the list. To our loyal listeners, I want to thank you for coming along again just to spend some time with us here. We hope you learned something. We hope you had fun, and we hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests. So please reach out via email to anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month, monogastric-focused topics on the second Tuesday of each month, and quarterly topics for the companion animal segment. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the latest schedule and to register for upcoming webinars.